Hello everyone, today we talk about the early Roman Imperial cult, especially the one of the 2nd century AD that naturally has important continuities as you can expect, just as in general the Roman Imperial cult had with the previous eras, and that we have already addressed, at least in general, and I think especially for the Julio-Claudians in other videos, so that you can start from those if you want to see how it had been established. Mostly I explained the actual meaning behind it. So today we will observe that, but also how it manifested, how it changed in the 2nd century AD. So we have seen how Augustus had established what we call an imperial cult of some sort. Now, the reason why I'm so generic is that it is wrong in the first place to assume that there wasn't such a thing like an imperial religion before Augustan times, right? It is wrong to assume that there wasn't an empire before Augustus, as much as there had been a republic, ideally. Of course, this didn't belong in any form to Roman mindset. The res publica populi Romani was held by the imperium, right, wielded by those Romans who had been virtuous enough to receive from God, that is Jupiter, such divine glory, and so the faculty to rule on his behalf, right, and more, right, not just on behalf, but let's say with a degree of divinity itself that, according to tradition, every human being technically has, but that these guys had managed individually to achieve more than others through also, and this is important, a transfigurational power, because, of course, spirit is superior to matter, and the concept is that humanity can rise up from the fall through this revitalization of the spirit. It's the same Romanity. I've explained this throughout countless videos, and especially the one about the moral superiority of Roman civilization, and the Indo-European interpretation, had to do with the reversal of a fallen kind. Right. Today I will not digress on a topic that is very interesting, as a matter of fact, the one of the establishment of the Golden Age in the Saturnia Tellus, how this is all one with the Augustan religion, the Aeneas, all the references that essentially are connected with the idea that Augustus had achieved essentially a divine power by putting an end to the civil wars between the people chosen by God, had also incidentally restored a golden age, even though the ancients were believing, in fact, to be living within the iron one in which we are still today, but they had also prophesied this golden era repristinated temporarily during the Iron Age, which has to do, in fact, also in Christian providence, given that Jesus was born under Augustus. In fact, this heavenly status that at least had allowed certain things to have happened. There was, of course, an eschatological perspective in all this. The myth that for the ancients time was cyclical is BS, right? It was in the chthonic peoples that the Indo-Europeans had crushed at large in Europe, that they had also been influenced by, and that's where Rome had emerged again to restore, even among some of the Italic peoples and in the Mediterranean and beyond, in fact the primacy of the Apollonian dimension, having in fact made their own also the Dionysian powers. There would be a lot about this to talk about, including the relation of the Romans with the various deities that they had de facto conquered themselves, and that they represented the nature of the world, for how it had fallen and split in all these various divine powers that always, however, stand from the one, and so that in order to be defeated had to be dealt with only through the highest unitary divine standard, in fact embodied by Jupiter. I made, by the way, a video some years ago about the official religion of the Roman army that in part deals with especially the imperial cult and the other ones existing. There is an interesting take there on the role of Mars that we will see now today, in the especially in relation to the first and the second Capitoline Triad. So things were more complex than we have usually been fed, like the idea of, again, the secularistic, modernistic idea that Augustus created a religion because now it was sort of created an empire, right? And so this thing was established at the time. Nobody really believed it because they were kind of atheists already, like us, and, whatever. This is completely, a load of garbage. Of course, the Roman Imperial cult was reinforced by Augustus as a means of unifying the Roman Empire under his rule and legitimizing his power. But it was, of course, founded on a traditional basis, and specifically the one of the long-standing Roman tradition of worshipping ancestors and the deification of deceased rulers, which had to do with that transcendental capacity that we have already described, and it was actually shared by practically everybody at the time. I mean, the Greeks believed the same things, etc. Just different peoples were at different, in different situations regarding to the relation with with God. And I can't stress enough how we're talking about one God, right? Not others, if not as hypotheses of the same. And no, this is not a Neoplatonic thing. This is how they literally believed that the thing actually was. And if you have any idea of how but we will explain it now, that Capitoline Triad, for example, work. I also made a video about the Fortuna Caesaris that reflects political, military, and social function anthropologically, and that this case is connected with Augustus because, given that Caesar had already been deified, this made Augustus the son of a god. By the way, Augustus, as you know, has the same etymological root of Sebastos in Hellenic, right? So this was the Latin equivalent for from the verb, in fact, augere, which means essentially to elevate oneself, to achieve that level of divinity, right, or becoming, right, in this sense, whatever was thought like at the time being in between, like literally a medium with the divinity. The res gestae are quite eloquent. Augustus himself says, through my own auspices, that is to say, of course, in Rome, there was no such thing like separation of state and religion, as inexplicably many, especially anti-Christians, actually believe for some sort. But this is in fact it was a positive thing, let's say, in the at least in the measure of divine attainment was believed in, right? But the idea, of course, is that the empire revolved around these very figures that, as part of literally against, right, this also somatic relics that remained after that on Earth. As you know, there all a particular rite associated to the imperial funeral, right? Not just the decursio, then the freeing of the eagle to heaven that had to represent, of course, the ascent of the soul, the same deification itself, but also the collection of the ashes, as you can appreciate in the mausoleum of Augustus in Rome still today. Of course, this represented an ambiguity, as we will see now, because technically what should have happened was a sort of, disappearance into a blaze, right? A bit like it had happened to Romulus. So there wasn't such a thing like a simple, let's say, the idea of a ascent to heaven, but remaining in the firmaments. That also Caesar was essentially turned into a comet, right? But this was not the sun yet. So we do not have, from the ancient world, aside from mythology, a specific doctrinal codification of how this functioned in their mind. Just all the religious, of course, evidence points toward that, except they had to make up for the fact that these people evidently hadn't managed to literally transcend their own flesh themselves. They were not considered gods in life, and so there was all sort of in between heaven and earth, where the various achievements of these very great rulers could be seen as, of course, supernatural, because the supernatural was always there in the first place, but the degree should have led to essentially to the end of the world in a good sense. I mean, the full re-achievement of divine unity, which eventually was yet to come. So this is also why the Christians suggested that this was was not quite the thing, that, as we will see now, the replication of deifications, the divine attributions to power were not matching with the metaphysical evidence, as a matter of fact. And this was the problem ever since, meaning that definitely Augustus embodies the highest achievement, right, in human civilization, and consequently in the Roman parabola was attained. But ever since, the world has kept going on and degenerating without any, in between, like a sort of other figures manifesting to the heights of these past attainments. So this is a completely different concept. But since I've made multiple videos on the topic, I often talk about traditional meaning, etc. Some people ask me about why didn't they stick to the older primal, say, belief, right, that existed millennia before Christ regarding this attainment. Well, because you should ask yourself, meaning that humans ever since have not showed the capacity to achieve that. Do you know any person that has transfigured divinely? Right, and in case you do, please tell us, because that would be quite a thing. The sense is that depending on this level of degeneration, we are going through other problems, such as the split, in fact, of state and church, which actually happened with Christianity, and not because of Christianity, but because of the conditions, in fact, that the world was in, and that Christianity was just, stating per se. The same goes for any kind of decadence, right? This arrived at the end. It's not one idiot would begin to say strange things and everybody followed that, right? This is self-evident in the same measure by which you're still mortal and suffering, right? So unless you fix that, you can't quite claim otherwise. The same goes for the Reformation, where you have the same church splitting, as a matter of fact. This goes up then the emergence, of course, of nationalism and or socialism, essentially altogether with atheism, the fourth estate, etc. So we are much closer than ever, really, to the complete annihilation of humanity. Don't be fooled by the level of power that is wielded. That definitely is, at some level, of course, that impressive, but it's not the merit of one. It's not a qualitative, rather a quantitative merit of mass society, not of the capacity of individuals to hold it. That's why it's actually also the most dangerous time in history, because just like, at the highest elevation, the failure is going to make you fall much more below than before. This is the entire also in the Bible, but it's pretty much everywhere, right? It's present all in the Indo-European mythology, the king that achieves but then betrays himself because of some... It's just like the parabola of, I don't know, the Norse hero. There is always some original sin that... so something you did wrong at some point that will make you fail anyway. And so Christianity actually elaborates on this and tells something in particular about what happened given the redemption of mankind, which is also not much essential as far as sort of impressed condition as some believe, but it's actually a moral boost that still entails that humanity has to fight for it, right? And the Gospels are pretty clear about this, telling the truth, and they're, in this sense, not at all different from what was believed ever before that. And if there are people that are weak and ignorant enough to pretend that this is just a soft, that Christianity has just a soft version, such just, it's a problem of people, right? Also of individual Christians. This has nothing to do with metaphysical reality and the condition of man, and in relation to God, which is beyond, Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings, that matter. And this is exactly what most people, I don't know, let's not even discuss atheism, but let's discuss alleged belief in the 21st century. I've never actually met a single believer that actually understands any of these points, right? It's just more like a team game, a sort of, I belong to this group. It's not different from all the various forms of alleged sexuality that mentally disturbed comes up with to cope with their own personal, cultural, moral failure. This is exactly the same thing. I'm this confession, I'm this other. Do you even know anything about history of religion? Have you ever actually studied what the Bible says, but for real, not that you are actually a Christian because just you were raised by Christians and you have a sort of fantasy idea of what that actually means. Have you ever studied Indo-European mythology? Have you ever studied any other mythology whatsoever? Have you ever studied Buddhism? If you still think that these are not all the same thing, just know that you will just remain dust, right? And at best, somebody else can save you. Yes, that is true, but you will not have participated in any meaningful way to that, and that is an individual as collective responsibility, because this is also the entire point of religion, as a matter of fact. Well, the Romans felt very deeply for this, right? The Roman elite, those who had created the empire, had basically as their sole, total, exclusive meaning in life this one, and nothing else, because of course, is there anything relevant at this point other than this? And that's the entire deal of, say, the Augustan imperial religion, which actually was the one that the Romans and basically any other people had been believing in. Just the Romans doing so from a more warlike, in fact, properly what we call imperial, archaic background, culturally speaking, but and being able, in fact, to achieve this incredible synthesis of tradition and modernity, without which you cannot achieve, right, what Augustus did. And obviously, the Augustan standard had remained, in fact, the golden one. Right, after Augustus, what was accomplished by him was literally realized as the establishment of the Golden Era, and any emperor that came after him was essentially challenged to be up to the same task. Penalty essentially making the empire decline, which is technically what happened in moral terms. Right, here we will look at, of course, the empire of big shots like Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, that really achieved the peak of Roman military power and life quality, respectively. But that, in this sense, just like all traditional myth says, right, at that point that you basically start softening up because you're somehow spoiled enough to forget, right, what this had been all about. And with a collective fault still for anything that had gone wrong in the first place. And this is valid for anyone. Again, no hero. This is what the in-between, the ambiguity between also the possibility of saving oneself or not, really lays in, right? We often, of course, as say, today we study these religions on the basis of a time in which they largely already believed that fate was essentially superior to them, so a sort of deterministic superstition. This is true for many peoples. The Romans evidently were not these ones. If you consider especially the Fortuna Caesaris there, it's all pretty eloquent. You find here and there among the the Germanic Norse sagas, the concept that sometimes maybe the hero can if anything, escape fate, but even at that point, they didn't think anymore that this was to redeem the world in the first place, so they were already convinced that there wasn't much you could do anyway. So this is also beyond, say, the difference between paganism and Christianity. That just a millenary process that had been going on across the world, and that we mostly are able to document in times in which, in fact, it had reached this point. What was extraordinary about the Romans is that they instead actually believed this up to very late in time, exactly the one in which they managed to achieve this empire, and in fact determining essentially the identity of every other empire ever since. The same reason why we have a Holy Roman Empire. We had actually still live in the past in some way, but why the entire point of recovering Romanity as the somatic essence that had achieved already the transfiguration of the world, also in Christian key, because as you understand at that point, they believed that providentially, and we will talk about the Providente today, Christ had been born, in fact, under Augustus for the same reason. There are passages of the Aeneid about the child Apollo that, as you know, was also the forever going on theme that, of course, the Christians identified as in an evangelical sense. So this is all another thing, but this is for telling you the enormity of the issue, and the fact that, of course, not just we have forgotten it today, but the fact that they lived, say, in the time of Vespasian, of Trajan, of Antoninus Pius, etc., into this belief. And the empire at this point was the world. I mean, Rome had literally conquered the entire known world, and it didn't make any difference to think otherwise, also because, as you know, the Roman Empire was far more extended than what we consider its frontiers, essentially because it was a metaphysical one, but also practically, right, in a materialistic sense, which can never be the issue, because of course the empire was about men and therefore moral forces. That is quite the case. These are incredibly crucial topics, again, that I will discuss forever, step by step, because I go just bit by bits, like today, this 2nd century AD thing. We will get to it, I promise you. But it's the background which we need for each one of these videos, because otherwise the average person who comes on this and they start talking about these things without explaining them, like, will start saying, what the hell are you talking about? Or I never heard this. Well, welcome to the ABC of basically the only thing that was ever believed in the entire world forever until a few couple of 100 years ago. Yes, there is all the issue of prehistory, and tradition had actually a very interesting explanation for that, that I also will make a video on. But here we are also transcending really, say, the physical reality, and therefore the academic standard of, let's say, historical explanation. But that's important because it's still history of thought, history of religion, history of philosophy, and even of science. You would be surprised to know, with surprisingly striking adherence to evidence, in fact. But I will again discuss this hopefully soon. I want to do this autumn, starting to do it in some orderly way. So the Julio-Claudians, again, I made a video on, were living within the properly a genetic continuity within the dynasty. Of course, these peoples believed that, as I explained before, they were molded within this genetic soma that was evidently better or worse predisposed in a sort of racial sense, for which, if of course you descended from the Julian clan, you would have had better chance, also because they literally believed to be descending from from Venus, etc. But and this was true, every patrician family, as you know, had boasted some kind of divine, but still all different. This is important because they realized the importance of such hierarchy, ancestry of sort. With the Flavians, of course, this changed because they were a different family, so that Vespasian reorganized somehow this cult, right? This was a moment of further consolidation of the empire towards a more centripetal direction. The imperial cult was expanded to at an individual, municipal, provincial, and imperial level, right? This had already been done under Augustus, that definitely had settled a lot of this. Remember that since these peoples all believed in the same thing, that it was very easy to actually make them believe the thing, if anything, and mostly because Rome had literally conquered them. And so this, of course, meant that whatever they had entrusted themselves to, other than their central god of thunder, of heaven, the Godfather, this was, in fact, the one that had conferred to Rome the right to rule over the world, and for the most obviously positive reason, because this was not a god that could do things differently, right? And it was the god, it was the source of every single other god, another entity, right? So that even though there were some other forces gravitating around it, think about how important it was for the Romans, Fortuna, right? Mother and daughter of gods, and that tells you everything. The obvious was that if Rome had walked into Greece, had walked into Egypt, etc., this was because they had the Romans had been greater than anybody that had been ruling there at that point, and so that they had also achieved an unprecedented level of power across the world, and these were really the chosen people by God. Specifically, the Flavians erected the temple of the deified Vespasian, and then of Titus, the temple of the Flavian family, which also became centers of imperial worship. There was all a system of financial support for the imperial cult, because as we will see now how it was organized across the empire, and this, of course, allowed it to thrive and spread throughout. The sense, of course, is that every Roman subject had been encompassed by this greatness. You were under the emperor, so he who held essentially the Holy Ghost, right, that had descended on him because of his virtue, right, that virtus, as you know, in the Roman culture, is the sum of all the other virtues, right? So that's exactly exemplifying the unitary concept of the Catholic Empire. The fact that this is the universal rule wanted by God, and that has and must remain unitary, for given the capacity to these subjects to be elevated, right, to the level of the rulers. This is what the Romans were doing through the concept of munus, the merit, let's say the reward duty that was necessary to become a Roman, and so being part of the chosen people was called to rule the world. The Romans, as we've seen, had very deeply ingrained this sense of redemption through manumission, the fact that all those who would fight for Rome were to be rewarded, and so this, in fact, as a universal anthropological formula, made the empire extended, being maintained in a unique way in human history, and it called really everybody to be up to the task, and otherwise being led by those who had that capacity. That's a fair mean. That's exactly what psychology, anthropology, we are wired to function this way with one another in the first place. The municipia, the provinciae, and the entire community under the Roman Imperium were to, of course, worship the imperial power as such, because it was believed that you came less to it, you would essentially weaken it, and so you couldn't, right? This is also the reason why the Romans are very often represented as those who tolerated every religion. First of all, it's not true at all, right? And I'm not referring specifically to the Christians that actually were being quite gently called to up to order and were not persecuted like other Chthonic cults and witchery that was, by the way, persecuted by everybody really back in the day, because it was completely against the heavenly nature of the empire itself. Right, it was a countering force. It was the one of the Pelasgian pre-Indo-European background that wanted to revert all to a sort of materialistic, feministic cult, right, of determinism and the dirt, right, as it's basically evident today, because that's what the Fourth Estate does. Of course, you do need an empire, you do need this hierarchy, and you do need it to rule from the sky. That's the same concept of deification, after all. There was a sense of continuous protection. Many concepts that we think being Christian even were already there in the meaning of course, the sense of protection, the sense of intercession, etc., that were not, as you've been presented again in the modernistic, materialistic sense, a sort of do des, where qui pro quo. They were something completely different. They entailed essentially your self-sacrifice in order to attain the greatest result, which had to be carried out by you. It was not something, say, I give you a little bit and you will give me a lot more. No, right? The sense is that, of course, you get a bit like the karma, right? You get what you give, right? Except, as we were saying before, the spirit has the capacity to elevate even matter. This is the same concept of why, of the resurrection, why Christ could not would just resurrect himself, but would multiply bread and fish, why would resurrect people from dead, would heal them, because the sense was, of course, that there was a transcendental capacity of divine power over the dead matter, that is the one that instead the imperial cult would prohibit from venerating, from worshipping, as many other materialistic say cults had done, right? They always identified, of course, a spiritual dimension, but this was a heavenly Indo-European religion par excellence, while the previous ones were essentially about the idea that you were doomed anyway, and there would be something else interceding for you in spite of whatever you can do, not to save you, but to basically swallow you, to devour you through your decomposition. It basically rebuilding you as still another object, animated by just the will of this deity, and just replicating that into nothingness, right? And actually, nobody fully believed that either, right? And that the reason why people were scared, of course, also of dying without being unaccomplished, without having transfigured themselves, and that's also why the reason we in Christianity, we of course we observe the sense that we are not enough, right? From a Catholic perspective, that is the traditional one that also was believed at the time, obviously, because that's the entire purpose of it. Works do have a value, right, in this eternal struggle, but it's recognized that you can't save yourself by yourself because you're too weak. It's not that you couldn't become God yourself, right? But the distance is so incommensurable that it's as if you couldn't anyway, and so there is the sense that you have still to abandon to let yourself, to entrust yourself to a higher power. And in a sense, the world like that at the time was like that. I mean, if you, for example, were not a Roman citizen, and so you could not partake this sort of moral genetic superiority, you were to hope that the empire would succeed, or that you would rise and become the greatest power ever. But of course, even after the end of the Roman Empire, this did not happen. So the tragedy of it all, in the sense that still at the time there was a deep concern, right, about how the same empire would go, and the Romans were aware of that. If you read Tacitus, well, he's quite eloquent about that. There is that sense of gloomy doom that you find also in the concept of the storming of the Asgard, etc., because you know that things can rise for some greater reason, like the one that Augustus had essentially received from Caesar, that had literally come out of the metaphysical space and the same res publica to save it through fortuna, in this daring military, in fact imperial capacity. But this was not just for everybody, and actually was a radical, brutal, traumatic, and violent discrimination in the Roman world, obviously, at every single level, right? The myth that this was a sort of tolerance system, it's BS, right? This is a system that essentially had made it beyond what everybody had and would historically, and that, of course, was incredibly aware that the average nobody from a conquered country that would have the capacity of meaningfully contributing to saving the world was not very sensible. Just like today, by the way, right? It's the same concept, right? It's always subtle. For example, Christianity came to say, like, look, never underestimate any life, because that's God-given. So that even, somebody so infamously killed like Christ could have the powers that happened with Christianity to take over the same Roman Empire just by the sheer power of the spirit, which is essentially what happened in Vedic religion with Siddhartha Gautama, right? Was a warrior who essentially realized that all those great exploits were nothing without a spiritual preparation. So this is also the meaning of it all, telling the truth. But municipia, say in English, like municipalities, provinces, whoever in the empire was, of course, bound to contribute to this salvation by obedience towards the emperor, he who had held the God-given empire. Right, a sense of unity and hierarchy here is of incredible importance. It's also a strategic principle, right? So this cult obviously was turned towards the dead emperors, because the Roman world, morally, culturally, spiritually, was not, of course, exactly because of the strength that it had showed in achieving this result, was not laying down arms. It was saying, "Oh, there's just one guy that also in life that is just like NCM, will simply is God just by now." Unfortunately, we do not have all the evidence we would like to understand how they would see the thing per se. Right, the fact that they were deified later is what we get happening, in fact, post-mortem. But it's obvious, like from several hints, that this aura of divinity was, by definition, not separable from what the guy was in real life, right? Also, as we were explaining before, the genetic connection was quite important, because there were some living, for example, relatives of the deified emperors that were, let's say, a biological testament to, or were supposed to be, to that moral standard that should have been facilitated by their somatic background, right? There was, of course, an association with Rome herself as a deity. The imperial cult knows exactly in the 2nd century AD the greatest expansion, right? Given that it was, of course, the peak of Roman Imperial power, and just the reflection of the same as a consequence. In order to understand the essence of the imperial cult, of course, we have to point out some characteristics that had been established by Augustus' institution, but of course being rooted, as we just explained, in a Roman Catholic tradition. One is the Jovian theology of the Principatus, right? Augustus had already, connected himself to Jupiter, albeit discreetly. Again, just like the term says, princeps is just like a prince, a first among equals, right? Of, again, not literal equals, because as we explained, of course, the patres, the senators, were all measurable through different power, right, and wealth and prestige, etc. But by approximation, of course, there was the sense that this was the first among these guys, and the first among the Romans, more generally. That was the elite in the first place, but still so, because Romanity was seen deeply at the basis of the capacity of wielding the imperium, because every Roman citizen had the duty as the privilege of bearing arms, and properly knowing how to fight and killing, because that's, as we've seen since the Roman conquest of Italy, is how the larger amount of the Roman citizenry had been conceived for. Naturally, at this point, it was slightly different, but considering the millions of people in arms during the civil wars, this wasn't something just ideal, right? So Augustus' discretion was enormous. As you know, this guy was simply the greatest politician in the history of mankind. He incorporated Jupiter definitely into his imperial cult. He did so, however, not explicitly. Right, as we were saying before, there was actually only one God, so everybody would understand what this really meant. Augustus emphasized his role as the son of a god, which technically was achieved by Caesar's deification, given that his uncle had adopted him as his legitimate son. There was also an association to Rome, right? The worship of Roma et Augustus together was part of this all. The idea, of course, is that both Caesar and Rome had all this obvious connection to the destiny of world conquest, and so only Jupiter could have basically provided them with this power, and being the closest that had ever come to heaven, of course, the association to this god was, of course, the Jovian one. Right. In the video about the Fortuna Caesaris, I explained in depth how Caesar was seen literally as a quasi-god, right? Even by political rivals like Cicero, that, however, were fair about that nobiliar ethos of divine tradition, and realized that the guy had something that, through his achievement, had made them shine through, but they didn't really think of it in a pragmatic way. They literally looked at the guy, even what he looked like as a human being, to observe this kind of qualities. Of course, as you know, Caesar declared that thanks to his ancestry, he descended from gods and kings, and this tells you a lot. But what their mentality also in this so-called republican period that never existed, nor they considered as such, if not just in the sense that there was an oligarchy there that was trying to see not one of these guys to rise above all the others, which they, in fact they failed to prevent, and therefore were convinced in a sense also by the achievement of this man that were definitely seen as uncommon in the first place. Now, I will not digress on all the entire sense of Caesar's fortune, or even Augustus' ending, or even the cause of the explanation of the civil wars in the first place. just bear in mind that the Romans truly believed that they were a God chosen people for the task of conquering the world, and that the civil wars had been essentially a catastrophe caused by a sin, a sacrilege, as a matter of fact, within the same Roman people. Somebody had infringed the Sibylline books, and this had turned into a disaster. So in order to break the Roman unity, you had to break the universal one, and somebody had to come out of the universe to fix the thing as a god de facto, and this was Caesar. And Augustus was his son. And remember this, that Augustus, in this regard, was incredibly deferent towards Caesar, right? He, of course, was acting, let's say, as a true monarch, as a matter of fact, but conceptually, his own empire had been providentially occurring only thanks to Caesar's accomplishment that was seen as much greater than his in that regard, right? This had impressed fundamentally all the other emperors, right? It was incredibly difficult to compare oneself to Augustus and collect his legacy, so that there were modifications, changes, etc. But just think what it meant to be a Roman emperor, especially in the 2nd century AD, and realizing the sheer extent of power that you had in your hands. You were truly chosen by God to rule the world. That's what you were doing. And this, of course, would transform the imperial cult itself towards a much more institutional, also family-based, and sort of statally connected one, right? So something that would be further formalized in a political sense, but that, of course, was not as primitive, archaic, and genuine as, say, Augustus had fundamentally created. Augustus was a guy that would have never tolerated, for example, another Roman citizen kneeling in front of him, right? The sense of individual liberty, the fact that you would have to just, this was a bit Alexander's legacy that, in fact, the Romans followed in the East, that just your presence, right? Not even the need to unseat the sword would have been enough to rule those who saw you, right? There's this episode, for example, of a druid that was talking with Octavian at a point, and he wanted to kill him, allegedly, because of what the Romans had done in Gaul. But while he was on this precipice over which he wanted to push him, Octavian looked at him, and this druid was allegedly struck by the eyes of Augustus, which was seen as like, this guy has powers. This guy is something else. There is a divine. It's a bit like, just think about the episodes in the Gospel where Christ is recognized, right? In that sense, also by, I don't know, very poor people. There is all there again what we were saying before, the sense that the human potential is much greater than it's thought. Here it was a druid that was considered, of course, a depot of wisdom. Druids were friends with the Romans in part, aside from, when the Romans began to persecute them for very concrete reasons regarding what was happening in Gaul and Britain. But Cicero was friend with Druids, etc. So there was an exchange about natural philosophy, this understanding of the world. And I think I never talked about the Druids themselves, but in the video about the Aedui, I discuss in part, because there are some specific figures that were also Druids, and that, in fact, the same acquaintance of Cicero there are referred to them. And there is a lot there, but very often not in the sense it's what Celticism tends to do. In any case, it's a very interesting topic. Trajan associated strictly the first of the Romans, so himself, to the first of the gods. Right? Before he was emperor himself, at least in the monarchic way, because of course there were various offices, as you know, provided with part of the imperium was dispensed, however, by the leader. Pliny the Younger says that while Trajan, in fact, was going to the capital, the mob had acclaimed him to the shout of Jupiter Imperator, right? And the reason was that Trajan had been celebrating his military victories, and he was seen, as you know, in the typically triumphal way, as essentially transfiguring into God, into Jupiter himself. Essentially, it's as if the Romans had collected the spoils of war from the battlefield, given in that sense by God himself, and they would bring them back to the Capitol Hill, to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, as everything had to be rendered to it, this higher principle of God, the truth, etc. So the idea that these guys were transfiguring, right, just like in the Jesus miracle of transfiguration, right, it starts literally having this aura around him because it was, becoming luminous, literally, was here intended in the same way, of course, among the Romans from quite a while, and just like everybody thought that this process of transfiguration would occur in a blaze, with a force of, and the look of thunder that of course was associated with the Godfather of heaven. So Jupiter, king of the gods, was in this sense the ancestral monarch, right, that also Rome had known, and that, however, had not remained, because of course the kings had proven to be weaker back in the day, especially with the with the Etruscan ones opposing themselves to the Roman patres, to the nobility. And so what you see as the Republic is technically the sense that there had not been anybody so great until Caesar, fundamentally, and then Augustus, right? So Trajan, by having distinguished himself as a successful general leading several major campaigns against Rome's enemies, was triumphantly identified as a leader during the classical ceremony to the capital, and that's what essentially also the people believed, right? This omen, by the way, that will also bring Trajan, of course, to become emperor, will establish Jupiter's presence that otherwise had not been emphasized by the other emperors in the imperial iconography, in imperial symbolism, in imperial cult itself, explicitly, right? And there is a very explicit, in fact, connection between Trajan and Jupiter, given that the god, in fact, delegates his powers to the emperor on the same arc of Benevent. That is to say, Trajan has become essentially Jupiter's vicar on earth, right? Remembers you anything regarding the figure of Christ as well? It's all the same thing. They came all from the same religion, the only one that had always existed in this meaning, right? Trajan's arc in Benevent, by the way, is dedicated by the emperor to the emperor's legendary campaigns in the east, right? So the arc is decorated with the scenes depicting Trajan receiving Jupiter's powers, indicating that the emperor was seen as a divine figure de facto, empowered by the gods themselves. So there is always, again, the idea that even though emperors were deified after death, because in theory the process by which this had happened was still seen as, again, the self-sacrifice in holy combat, etc. And nobody really could testify to what would happen later, unless the world had been transfigured, which wasn't happening. But still, there was an idea that such divinity was present to a definitely this for sure, a much greater extent in that man than others, right? In virtue of the fact that he was at the head of the world. Trajan is also addressed as Optimus Princeps, famously enough. So Optimus means good in all things, meaning divinely perfect, as far as his imperial wielding was concerned. The same attribute of Jupiter, Optimus, in fact, Maximus. This would further emphasize Trajan's status as a highly regarded leader in the eyes of God and the people. There are, of course, other literary, historical, and artistic references for Trajan's connection to Jupiter, including, for example, his depiction on coinage with Jupiter's likeness, the construction of the Temple of Trajan of Rome later on, and obviously this was about still considering this deification as driven fundamentally by the god, right? So the one that would pull, after all the strings, but through this man, because the dual nature there was evident. That's the entire point, again, also of Christ's natures. Those who thought that it was just essentially a human one were ignoring the divinity of mankind. It's a bit like a Gnostic Protestant heresy ante litteram, even though Gnosticism was, of course, already there. Now, from Trajan onwards, such Jovian dogma, as clear and solid as established by the emperor, is confirmed by his successors. Right? Trajan definitely had embodied a massive political and military power, for which, you know, the prestige of the empire left aggrandized by his conquests was understood to have been bound to that greatness in order to be preserved. For example, an eagle tends the scepter to Hadrian, which is quite meaningful, right there. The eagle, I made a video about the Roman aquila, as a matter of fact, in the broader Indo-European symbolism, was sacred, of course, bird of Rome, the only one that could rise up to the sun and watching straight into God's eyes. The predatory nature of the empire was all one with this, an element of pure force, right? Sacred fire, to which in fact was associated also in the imperial funeral, right? Emerging from the burning pyre of the emperor as the soul, the deified soul of the same, reverting to God. Hadrian, as you know, was also, contrarily to common saying, very much of a military guy. He frequented the frontiers and the army quite much. Speaking of this Jovian symbolism, Providentia lends the thunder to Antoninus Pius, right? Providentia there means a lot because it was connected deeply with the sense of the Indo-European dux. She was the Roman goddess of foresight and wisdom. Provideo, it means to see further, and this is particularly important because in the European religion, vision, just like this was also more universal. Think about the eye of Ra, not just has to do with the wisdom, right? Like the visots, the attribute of Walden, etc. But it has to do properly with the concretization of the world order through such vision, the idea is that these guys were so powerful they would just open their eyes and the world would take the form that they had decided. Rome was exactly to maintain this capacity in controlling the empire. And in this case, Providence is shown holding the thunderbolt, a symbol of Jupiter's power, and pointing towards the earth, symbolizing her role in shaping events. So the idea was God given to this human medium, that would have had to be elevated as the same status, the faculty of ruling on his behalf on earth down, right, from top to bottom, right, and literally molding the world at his own image. This is particularly important as a concept. This is showed, by the way, on a coin, right? So this symbolism, by the way, was also pretty popular, as we will explain better, because the imperial cult was spread among the population, as a matter of fact. It was not just a sort of elite wishful thinking. It really constituted the original belief of also all the religions that we know. Just we completely lost the meaning because we, at least in our nationalist socialist society, nationalist and or socialist, it's actually the same. The sense that there can be any trace of individual capacity, so that you're basically to be considered a lesser person if you're not as good as somebody else, is completely removed because of the weakness and the paranoia of incapable people that just must relativize everything, and in fact not accepting something superior to any other power in the world that is greater than themselves. This is exactly the mental illness through which essentially almost the entirety of the world population is going through right now. And at the time, this was seen as probably the worst thing that could happen to you. So needless to say, these people would have not been so glad to see what we got to say the least. The same Jupiter helps Marcus Aurelius in his clashes against the barbarians. Think about Jupiter Pluvius, right? The miracle of the rain, also interpreted positively by the Christians themselves. The Roman army campaigning in Bohemia was cut out by the barbarians from large enough pools of fresh water, and you know how logistically detrimental this is. So a thunderstorm arrives, and this is of course seen as Jupiter that provided the winners, right, with enough water. And this is very interesting, by the way, because here we are talking about, of course, the campaigns of the Marcomannic Wars, and the Germans had in Woden, of course, the god of thunder, rain, etc., and the sense that Germans would look at whose side the thundering clouds were, as the sign, of course, of who held the Imperium. There is a beautiful passage from the Historia Langobardorum in which it's remembered how before a battle, a thunderstorm arrived from the back of the Longobards, right? So from their side, against their enemies. Of course, the Longobards won. So just consider this miracle that was celebrated famously enough also on Marcus Aurelius' column, how relevant, how meaningful, how important would appear to everybody, including, again, the peoples that inhabited beyond what we consider the border of the Roman Empire, that of course did not exist. The Romans didn't think of it in the same, at least in the same way. So we don't have to be surprised at all to see the multiplication in provincial cities in Antonine times, especially between the 50s and the 70s of the 2nd century, temples of the Capitoline Triad. that of course had to do with Jupiter. Now there were two triads. One was the archaic, the original one of Rome, that was Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. The second one, the one updated to more sort of universal values, was the one of Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno. Now the meaning is always the same, actually, because Jupiter is the godfather. He represents wisdom, so in the Clausewitzian Trinity, the first element of reason, right, and the one that orders the world, right. Then you have essentially the element of war, the taste for war properly and gamble, right, the capacity of knowing how to handle yourself in danger, in peril. And of course at the beginning was Mars, that was as Mars Ultor, literally also in the Roman, still remaining of course as a deity next to Minerva, in the official religion of the Roman Empire, as the one that literally poured what the Romans would call the furor among the barbarians. Others would say the virtus, especially the most archaic Romans. And again, I made some videos here and there about Roman archaic warfare that explains a bit the thing. In any case, was the military element. Minerva, Athena, is of course the goddess of war, right? Together with Apollo, by the way, the most, in fact, Apollonian symbol, the heavenly, pure. She's a virgin. She's the unspoiled female element, the most spiritual and strong. And so the one also associated, think about say this other important feminine deities like Rome herself, but Fortuna as well, that was so important in that sense of gamble, of chance, of war, that as we've seen being used by Caesar exactly to fix, to establish this new order in the first place. And then the chthonic element, the people, the one of primordial hatred, the fallen kind of human one. So in again archaic times it was Quirinus, which was a symbol of the average guy, right? The Quirites were the Romans, as you know, and that here instead is represented by Juno. Juno, that is in this sense, of course, the wife of the godfather, and that embodies all the feminine symbolism, right? The one of essentially the transfigured Dionysian forces that now are tamed and possessed and transfigured in holy combat by the godfather that has won them, like has invalidated her as a woman, and so transfigured her. I made a video specifically about this, that is taming the female demon of victory, like in the Indo-European holy combat. And she represents, therefore, all these enormous forces of the world that are normally, say, of the earth, of the dirt, that are normally, also, of course, the feminine one, the one connected to fertility, to the earth, etc., that are monstrous, also one of the seas, etc., that, however, are ordered in this exactly through the second element, the one of war, that is the Roman conquest, that embodies also the possession of the woman in this in the mechanism, and that therefore is now ordered, is pacified, right? The Pax Romana, think about this, and this was naturally a very powerful way of representing not just the emperor as the godfather, but of course Juno as the wife, right, of, for example, Antoninus Pius. In the Antonine column base, there is Faustina Meyer, his wife, that is represented not just as Juno, but with the scepter. Remember, as we said here, that the Provident gives the scepter to Hadrian. Well, this is pretty much the same thing, right? Meaning, literally here, that Juno has acquired the capacity herself as the subject element of the empire to maintain order, right? And this, of course, function is delegated to the empress, right? And this, as the scepter has been conferred to her by her husband, by God, and by God to him in turn. This, of course, is aimed at reinforcing the importance of the Domus Augusta, as we will see now, so properly the establishment of a Roman court as a broader clan that now can affirm itself in a truly dynastic monarchic fashion. Of course, the nature of the Roman imperial rule was changing in that direction. Some people said, well, here there is a sort of weakening of the moral finesse, right, and true spirituality of the concept. But the idea is still that the empire is quantitatively more powerful than before. And of course, yes, there is this process of degeneration through the eras that every people undergoes. But the point is also strengthening, right? The true concept that this empire is led by a Jovian stock, right? Because exactly in the same period, we witnessed the total assimilation of the deified emperors to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, right? We can see it, as we will see now, also in the provinces, with the cult, for example, of Baalbek in Heliopolis is essentially the Jupiter version, the godfather of heaven, the god of the rain, in this Phoenician context. But the idea is that the empire is consolidating, in fact, also as a state. As you know, many peoples that before were used as sort of buffer clients, etc., are now being assimilated directly by the Roman administration. The empire is becoming bulkier. It's starting to face new challenges, but it's also the great peak, right, of the empire. Another important aspect of the 2nd century Roman Imperial cult is the one of the dead emperors. In 183 of the 16 deified officially honored by a cult, because naturally not all emperors had been deified, this is also important, 12 belonged to the most, in fact, recent Antonine dynasty. To the deified emperors, so we're talking about, by the way, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, Lucius Verus. There are also other elements of their family, including sisters, spouses of emperors. Interestingly enough, we have seen the meaning there. There is, say, a female element as the completion of that greater order. Before, say, in Augustan times, this concept was skipped, in part because still never talked about this in a single video, but as you know, the woman was really thought to be, again, incapable, say, undignified, right, to be able to be represented not as an hypostasized divine force, but as an actual human being that could be transfigured, but only by her husband, right? And the sense was that, of course, in Augustan times, of course, people were less liberal than in later times, but also there was a problem in the concept of dynastic union, right? Augustus, again, was playing as a leader of warriors among warriors, a bit like Romulus would have been, right? Ideally, of course, because Augustus wasn't much of a physical fighter, but the guy had, perhaps exactly because of that, an incredible spiritual load, as you know. In any case, there are surely some Hellenistic influences in here, the introduction of more feminine symbolism, and the acceptation also of a dynastic, right, a courtly milieu that would at that point, of course, be so. Women were highly considered within that sphere, as you know, in Roman society, right? In the house, the same concept of matrimonium was because the woman had a great power within the house, not publicly, right? She had to rise to give birth and to rise a true Roman that had to be a warrior. So there was a lot there in terms of the radical importance of Roman women. Don't get me wrong, but there was also a different role, in fact, that at this point could be sublimated just because we're talking about now the imperial family ruling over the world, and there weren't others, right? So either by calculation, by the way, politically, or sort of natural development, the Domus Augusta, so the imperial house, occupies an ever more eminent place in religious life, right? Essentially, we're also contenting the masses, the Pelasgian ones, the more Hellenized, with some other figures that it could be worshipped. Like we have, I don't know, in Egypt there was a cult of Antoninus, Hadrian's lover, for example, right? Of course, say that the western half of the empire was a bit more, traditional regarding these things. They would have not, but say it's just like Augustus was essentially a Roman citizen, like another in Rome, while he could be represented like a pharaoh in Egypt. Right, so this is a very important aspect of the story. So female figures were stronger, as you know, in those worlds historically, and it's even possible that the Roman emperors definitely were not that, at this point especially, that inclined to, let's say, Orientalism per se. We're using this politically in an incredibly and rigidly patriarchal system, of course, as the entire Roman culture truly and always was. And almost every time a temple was elevated, some sodales were established, right? The sodales were the members of essentially this religious circles or / brotherhoods within the imperial Roman cult, right? So they would devote themselves to these various figures, including the one of the deified emperors. For example, for Hadrian, for Antoninus Pius, they were created. And as you know, Roman religion was very complex, as, say, enormous the system was. So today we don't have time to descend into the various, but of course there was plenty of different cults that were, however, all feudally subordinated to the heavenly Apollonian virile one of the imperator. This was also manifested, as you know, in war. There was an idea that the imago imperatoris per se, because of the actual physicality of the emperor, could manifest itself as a divine force on the field. So we're talking about people really bringing to that extent the awareness that these guys were sort of demigods, as basically the whole world had been obsessed with from a long time, in virtue of the fact that they were objectively the most powerful people out there. So nobody was above them, and this had to mean something, which is the traditional meaning of the empire. There was a great success of the imperial cult in the provinces, in the municipia, etc. By the 2nd century, it was well inserted in the urban world, in the countryside. And of course, the modalities did vary according to the provinces, and with different local assemblies. We've seen it in that series I started about the Roman provinces. I had to go on with either it was a concilium or a koinon, with often some original districts. For example, the three Gauls, the numerous reorganizations of Syria. But the loyalty of the people that is expressed during these assemblies seems genuine. What happened in these councils is that essentially the elite of these provinces would come to swear allegiance to the imperial cult, because that was the single most binding proof of loyalty, and that's why also the Romans were so fixated with that, to the point of persecuting Christians who refused to do that, because they again refused the concept that those guys were actually gods, right? It was a matter of freedom of conscience, and it is true that for the Romans it had become at some point a matter of formalism, but you can never quite say this, in the sense that yes, there were lots of people who surely would do it just because, but the awareness of the ancient world regarding this power existing is at the same time the one that was holding the empire together, as literally as well, right? And things began to go wrong only when the empire was not capable of providing for that same military power that it was thought to be manifested like, even just through deterrence that had, of course, allowed the majority of these countries to remain for centuries and centuries fundamentally peaceful. That's where the criticism to this deification, that was somehow skeletonizing. For example, I don't know, in ancient Greece there were similar things. There were some statues made to certain guys that basically had done nothing even particularly notable as local magistrates, except having died, right? So being represented this sort of heroic fashion. The Romans, of course, had taken the matter much more seriously, because again, they had created the Roman Empire, so evidently the thing was a hell of an accomplishment. But again, what the people felt about that, what I was saying before regarding this sense of hierarchy, of social stratification, the fact that it was plenty of people that depended on the empire in a way or another, is crucial here, because you cannot govern any place without the decisive moral support of the people, right? Always remember this, that again, the new nationalist and or socialist fourth estate or mental delusion is that you're a good person just because you exist, and you have no responsibility whatever your government does, right? You doing or not doing something always entails a responsibility, and if your country is a genocidal maniac that goes around exterminating people, it's your fault. And according to tradition, to the entire extent that this happens, because in theory your divine potential can't prevent this from happening, but you're not just even trying. There's a point at which you say, oh well, but I don't care. And so you basically sink into nothingness, also because it means that you literally have no power. And guess why this is the favorite religion of the lesser people today? Because, avoiding any kind of value in someone's life also means not to temporarily, let's say, momentarily doing anything, which is essentially the first objective of the majority of the human population, that is being completely stripped of any spiritual dignity. So, in case you wonder, at the time things were different, right? Some people, again, go around thinking that ancient rulers, just because they were of course in need of a great ego to rule, well, a little thing like the globe, were, I don't know, some sort of buffoons, some sort of bombastic, again, egomaniacs, etc. No, these people were tempered, cultivated, brought up, refined through this sheer amount of crushing responsibility that nobody else in the entire empire had, and that, of course, the average fourth estate cannot accept today, and prefers to believe, I don't know, in the myth of the butchers, of all what is the deterministic, materialistic, relativistic superstition of it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. so that they can keep hiding away more like a rat into nothingness. And this is exactly what at the time was thought to be the end of people, into nothing, of these people into nothingness, essentially going wasted, not having contributed to the survival of human life, and so the divine power contained in it, and so lost also to the let's say the problem of the others, because technically the Romans had the task of again redeeming them, right? So whoever fails in winning the others is also culpable in this regard. In other words, every person has infinite responsibility and infinite fault, and that's also what the original sin really is, unless they don't do something or they try. And again, the only way to fix everything is God. So you understand why it was so important for the world order to have a leader who would identify with God himself. Now, these doubts, these misconceptions have brought to the idea that, I don't know, the people somehow didn't care about this imperial cult, right? For the fact that, again, literally some idiot in the 20th century decided to think that that something official must be just, enforced and superficially believed. This is completely wrong and false, right? It seems, on the contrary, that the amor Augusti, so the love towards also the emperor, was well rooted in the hearts and the consciousness, right? Every emperor, of course, had taken the name of Augustus. There was also this sort of mechanism for which, again, in theory, there was no clear succession line, as you know, even in the dynasties, but the idea was that at least the presumptive heir would have to be called Caesar. And so there would have been dispatched as first the accomplishment as a youthful power, and then the wise guy that had to control everything, in the later age. It was part of the pedagogic sense of how you had to be nurtured. I made a bit about the quality of the Roman leadership, and so how the entire cursus honorum was designed exactly to achieve this result morally. But of course, this love for Augustus was rooted in the hearts, in the consciousness, in the collective one. This is something that we tend to somehow ignore in the Catholic meaning of the empire, that, again, this belief was collective for what I just explained to you. There was no individualistic atomization of reality. There was no moral relativism. There was no sense that what happened, especially in such a much tougher world like that, was somehow something you could simply turn away from because you're just parasitically maintained by somebody that has been better than you in order to provide you with a house, with a job, and everything, right? And thinking that you somehow have a value that can't just move within those things. People were literally looking at the ultimate meaning of existence, the end of the world, the sense of pride also belonging to this greatness, the faith, in fact, they had in these rulers to preserve this world order. There are, of course, divine and, say, divinizable aspects of imperial action that are worshipped. Sacrifices are celebrated for the health of the sovereign, for example. Some witnesses demonstrate that within the cities, like in the countryside, in Italy as in the provinces, there is, within the imperial inhabitants, a substantial devotion towards this broader belief. And of course, you must rely on a leader. You must rely on someone that is capable of doing those great things that, after all, everybody knows about, right? These were worlds, rising with again, obsession for heroic accomplishment, right? Even peasants thought this to some extent. At least we can think, especially the Western provinces, the European ones especially, being pretty much more aware of the direct participation, for example, to the military, etc. In the East, there was surely a more, say, sensual way of thinking, and somehow that greater superstition and relativism. But overall, like, let's not underestimate also the warlike character of many peoples from Asia, from Africa, that were also serving in the Roman legions with great effect, ferocity, and exactly that barbarity that the great empire had managed to tame, to channel against the enemies of God. So we're definitely looking at, say, political and social phenomena that are actually very observable, like, of course, to different degree, different scale, different depth in any historical time, right? We just be aware that you have been rising in a world that has fundamentally been built on the antithesis of this, which doesn't mean that all what you've known has not preserved part of this meaning, as a matter of fact, but you are being pushed in the other direction. So not understanding how even great part of what we treasure as modern prerogatives in terms of the ones that do actually work stems from what had already been established, by the way, by these systems that instead we paint as some sort of, obscurely tyrannic or arbitrarily so, it's somehow incompatible and, morally recognizable ones compared to ours. Just know that we are just there, right, without actually much of in the same very place, in the same human condition, actually in a even more disadvantaged one in terms of transcendental potential or this capacity, essentially because of your fault, right? You, right? Of course, all the people that surround you, but especially you, because you are the only person who can make leverage on your own potential, right? And that's what the Romans thought, right? That the world could be redeemed, right? And they tried, and they achieved at least much more than any other polity in human history, given these dynamics that I explained, ever did, right? You can look at other great empires in history, but the level of redemptional moral empowerment that Rome achieved, considering also the long-lasting results in the history of Western civilization, is not really debatable. You can't say that the Mongol Empire did this. You can't say that China did this at some point. They were completely different systems mentally, right? And there is this sort of strange games for which we believe that this is somehow, still, we're talking about an empire like another. Nor everything that happened after essentially the desacralization of power can be seen as that. That is not, it's not to say there can't be a substantial improvement, right? But without form, the substance, as I was saying in the beginning of the video, just becomes just a huge blob that is basically out of control, right? So it's actually the triumph of the dark forces, the ones that Rome had managed to tame by giving an order that was deeply ingrained as the cornerstone of Western identity and civilization throughout any idea of empire that existed, and the continuation until the 19th century, which is entirely violent, by the way. Like, if you're interested in the Renovatio Imperii, I made a lot of videos about this meaning, and I want to do something next because I think I should explain better what Christianity exactly did in this, which also gets misunderstood all the time, and what was the Holy Roman Empire and why it was perfectly legitimate, Romanly speaking, even more than actually the Byzantine one, to some degree at least. Like in the degree the Byzantines claimed that this could not be an empire just because they had not appointed it themselves, which is understandable to some degree, but not in front of the establishment of an actual empire. And the manifestation of that military force that was, in a way or another, even in just one of its affiliations, the one that destroyed the same Byzantine power at some point. So it's somehow interesting. I'm talking about the Fourth Crusade, by the way. So I'm not saying this is not dramatic, or that I'm just making the case that, as you know, I made lots of videos about Byzantine history. I always studied it as much as I could back in university, etc. But I also developed my quite consistently strong idea, the more I studied all this, about the absolute validity of the Holy Roman Empire and a much more primal meaning that is, in fact, much closer to Rome than Constantinople in some ways. I mean, what the Germans were doing was not... that's also what the Romans admired of the Germans exactly in times like the 2nd century, the 1st, and even later. But we'll have to look at that, because the Ghibelline Middle Ages is a lot of stuff, and it also does get often misunderstood. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel for receiving my upcoming content. We'll surely talk about the Roman Imperial cult again. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.